welcome to today's video. My name is Thimbles and today we're looking at the embroidery pieces I created for my first ever art challenge, the Spooky Artist Challenge, which was hosted on Instagram by the lovely Dakshagiri and Moo 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 Illustration. I wanted to try an art challenge mainly to see if it would help my presence over on Instagram. I do love finding artists on there and I love it acts as a portfolio for my own work, but I do struggle with it. I find posting consistently very difficult and I find it a bit overwhelming at times. So I figured joining an art challenge would help me be a part of a community for a while and make the whole experience feel a bit more natural and fun. Also, I love this time of year. I really love the time around Halloween. So I was more than happy to sign up to a bit of a bigger challenge to really embrace and enjoy the season. So starting with the first prompt, painting pumpkins. From an embroidery perspective, really the only stitch I've used here has been long and short stitch, also known as thread painting, which is my go-to stitch for creating realistic designs. Wherever I want an area to have a clear edge, I've outlined it with split stitch, which is my preferred method of outlining. I kind of wish I'd done the edges of the ghost using 2 strands of thread rather than 1, because outline stitches can also raise the edges a little, giving it a bit more of a 3D effect. So if I'd done that for the arms or for the folds in the sheet, it could have given the piece a little bit more depth, a little bit more like 3D effect. And then I've got these smaller metallic stitches for embellishments around the ghost. Overall, I really loved embroidering this. There was a moment while embroidering the pumpkin in particular where I realised just how beautiful the medium of thread is for illustrative work. Because you're working with little strokes of solid colours, there is an impressionist vibe to the finished piece, and seeing that effect come together in that small colourful pumpkin was just really satisfying. One of the hardest aspects of this piece was picking out the colour for the tablecloth. So everything else sort of had an obvious colour for it, but the tablecloth colour was completely up to me. I ended up settling on this nice light pink with the darker tones being this lovely dusky pink colour, but the choice was rushed. I didn't do a very good job of picking out transitioning colours in particular. I feel there needs to be another transition colour between the dark and the light pinks. They haven't blended together all that well. There are perspective issues, like here, why is this little kink here? I think it needs to kick out slightly further down. Also, I feel there isn't enough room for these pumpkins. They need to be placed further forward from the tablecloth. But that's alright. I get my technical skills as an artist are pretty underdeveloped, and trying something like this gives me ideas for what I need to work on. There was one big issue with this piece. I drew this outer line with a heat erasable marker in case I wanted to add any sort of background or embellishments at the end. With it being my first embroidery piece for the challenge, I decided to keep the design really nice and simple. I didn't add any embellishments. I just thought the little scene looked great as it was, and I didn't want to take away from my cute little artist ghost. So once I finished that main scene, I finished the piece. I'd also finished ahead of schedule, which is sort of unheard of for me, so I was really happy about it. But when I went to remove the heat erasable marker, I saw this ghost line appear. Ghost lines are just really pale lines left behind by the marker. And I tried everything to get rid of it. I used just water and that didn't really help. So I started to use water and soap and that helped a little bit, but not too much. I was just getting myself into a really bad headspace where I couldn't get rid of this line. And with it, if this were a piece for myself without a deadline, which I wasn't going to share on Instagram, then I wouldn't have cared. But this was the first piece I was going to share for the challenge. And to have such an unsightly line, something so obvious, it was just horrifying me. I didn't want to put it out there as the first piece to sort of be judged by the community at large. I know that they weren't going to ever say anything mean about it, but I just didn't want it there. So I went back and I decided to add embellishments. I decided that was the way I was going to deal with it. I was just going to cover it. This time I used chalk to draw out any details which I needed to add. And I also used the chalk to try and make the outer circle more circular. So even though the outer circle would have been thicker, I just wanted it to be as circular as I could get it. But I didn't like the embellishments I was adding. It's not that I thought they were bad per se, I just didn't think they were needed. And I really didn't want to add a thick gold line around the outside of the work. So I went back to try and wash the ghost line out of the fabric just again, only to realise that the chalk I'd used was also proving really difficult to remove. In the end, I saw baby wipes recommended for removing the chalk lines and stain removers were recommended for the ghost lines. I wasn't prepared to use chemicals on my work without testing them beforehand, so I just used baby wipes and soap and water for trying to remove both the chalk and the stain lines. And I just kept washing the piece until the lines were very pale, and then I just decided to finish. There was no point in stressing and rushing this. I was starting to worry I'd damage the piece if I continued. I figured I could always come back to this at a later date when I wasn't stressing about deadlines to work on removing any remaining lines. But now the challenge is over, I reckon I'll just leave it as it is. I'm pretty happy with the piece. Now looking back, far less stress. I really love this piece. I thought it was a really lovely way to start the challenge. I'm saying it now, I think it is my favourite. He's my favourite little ghost out of all of them. He's super cute, not so spooky, and he's a fellow creative to boot, so I think he has my heart. Okay, so prompt 2 was cute and witchy baking. The inspiration for this piece was herb related. So when I was looking up witchy things to include in the piece and what's associated with witches, herbs and flowers came up a lot. And I figured that made a lot of sense. Obviously, they make potions, but even in a more real-world sense, it's my understanding that witches were often considered as of-the-time healers who used herbs in their medicines. So I quite like the idea of incorporating that into my piece. It would also give me the chance to add different embroidery stitches here to try and mimic herbs and flowers, playing to the strengths of embroidery as an art medium, having all these different textures. Onto the piece. From an embroidery perspective, there isn't much difference between this one and the first prompt, other than using French knots alongside split stitch and thread painting. There's a moment in the video for this piece where you can see me remove some yellow French knots. I'd used 2 twists with 1 strand of floss and found this created too big a knot. I wanted my French knots to be as small as possible, so I removed those large French knots and added French knots with only 1 twist. I'd also changed the colour of the thread to a slightly darker yellow because I thought it suited the colour palette better. There's also a moment in the piece where I decided to change the apron a bit. There was a section I'd embroidered in shadow, which I didn't think looked right, so I went back and embroidered over it in a lighter tone so that it was now not in shadow. Embroidering over your mistakes is very much an option in embroidery. It's sometimes a better option than removing threads, as that might damage your work overall. Regarding the design, I have a real love-hate relationship with this piece, so I'll start with the pros before moving on to the cons. I think the floral surroundings worked really well, really well. If I was going to change something regarding this floral background, I'd have it go all the way around the ghost. I think the circle is just a tad too small. And then it's more consistent with the other embroidery pieces that often have the embellishments going all the way around. Also, note, I've still got the issue with my transfer method. So in this instance, I used chalk for this piece, as I didn't have an alternative transfer method for such a dark fabric. I washed this several times and I used baby wipes on it, and the chalk is still pretty noticeable. So learn from my mistakes, test out your transfer method on a scrap of paper you're using before committing, and then you know how to deal with it at the end of your piece. Beyond this, I like the colour palettes. I tend to prefer warmer, earthier colour palettes, but when I think of witches, I tend to think more of greens, purples and blues. And so that's what I've tried to capture here, and I actually think it looks really lovely together. Considering I often really struggle to pick out colours that go well together, I am actually really happy with this piece. I was really stumped about what colour to do the apron in. I was thinking maybe yellow or green, but in the end I chose this really pale purple blue. And I don't know if it's the right colour for an apron, but I feel like it's really magical colour. I don't know why, maybe it's because it reminds me of Cinderella's dress in the live action adaptation, but I think it really suits a witchy themed piece. Also the hat. I really love my little witch's hat. I think it's the element in the piece which really gives it an illustrative feel. It's sort of similar to what I was saying about the pumpkin in prompt 1, that there are some things that I've embroidered that just feel very fun and illustrative, like they belong in sort of a fairy tale book. I actually do really like the little cupcakes. They're obviously sisters and not twins. I think on the Great British Bake Off, Paul Hollywood would have quite a few words for them. But I do think they're quite fun. I like seeing the little cherry on top as just a little bit of a burst of colour in the central character. So I think they're quite cute. Moving on to the cons, of which there are a few. Starting with the ghost. So I had a real issue trying to add clothing to add shape to something I feel is pretty formless. I think it ends up looking a bit weird. And to be honest, I think she looks a tad bit like Mr. Blobby. Also the hands. They were going to be baking gloves, but I thought it would be faster to stick with them just being the same colour as the rest of the ghost. And so I thought I'd stick with them just being hands. And they've ended up looking like crab claws. They're so thick and unwieldy, I don't think they look very good at all. And the apron doesn't really look like an apron, it looks more like a dress. I took another look at aprons once I'd finished the piece, and they're often not that frilly. Maybe having quite a frilly ghost body with a more structured apron skirt would have looked better and would have made a clear difference between the two. So personally, I think the biggest issue with this piece was that I kept asking myself, did this really meet the prompt of cute and witchy baking? It had all made sense in my head while sketching it, but I remember posting this one and I compared what I created to others and it felt like it had missed the prompt entirely, and I ended up wishing I'd gone for the other sketch that I'd done, the one where it was a bit more of a scene of a ghost cooking in a kitchen, just to have a stronger connection to the whole baking theme. Seeing it now as part of this whole challenge with the others, I think is a really wonderful but unique addition to the set. So prompt 3 was Scary Art Market Stall, which I was actually really excited for. After feeling so disappointed in the previous design, I decided to really have fun with this prompt. Going into this challenge, I was very aware that embroidery is a time-intensive craft. So the larger and more complex the piece, the more likely I'd miss the prompt deadlines, so I did have to put limitations on myself when I was designing. Even if I had an idea to add loads of different characters or to add more to a scene, I actually didn't even bother sketching it because I knew I wouldn't be able to embroider a piece in time for the deadline. Also, there's only so much detail I can actually just achieve in embroidery, so I avoided anything being really small or really complex. For this prompt, I just ignored all these things, you know? I felt I was holding myself back, so here I just started adding anything I thought of. I added it to the scene. In the end, I settled on embroidering an embroidery stand, as that seemed to be the most sort of relevant and felt right. Okay, so moving on to the embroidery piece itself. Embroidery-wise, I really tried to lean into the strengths of embroidery, mainly that it's a very tactile art form and I can create lots of texture using different stitches. So I've used surface darning stitch for the scarf with turkey work at the end. I've used French knots, satin stitch and brick stitch for those woven sort of pieces of art at the bottom. Then I've used chain stitch to try and imitate a knitted texture for the scarf and hat. I tried to use seal-on stitch here, but found the space was just too small. Seal-on stitch really looks like knitting, and that's because there isn't actually much stitching when you're completing seal-on stitch. It's more like you're looping and threading your thread to create a little piece of knitting rather than stitching through the fabric. Regarding the design, I'm really happy with it. Everything I just said regarding using the different embroidery stitches to add textures to the design, I think they worked really well. It's quite nice that by this stage you can really feel each prompt has its own personality and its own unique feel and look. This one definitely feels the coziest and perhaps a little Christmassy with the gold stars around it. I love my two little characters. Because the apron hadn't quite worked out in the previous prompt, I really questioned what sort of clothing I could add because they just looked a bit bare without anything. So I was quite happy with adding the scarves and the hats to add a bit more interest to the design and just to add an extra cozy feeling. The lights look really nice too. I wondered for a little while how to embroider light. It's not something I've done before, but I think they capture that warm, twinkly look you get with fairy lights at night. I'm really happy with how they turned out. Things I'd change next time, I'd maybe swap around the colours I've used for the embroidery stall. I think it's overall too dark. It might be as simple as swapping the two brown colours around so that the darker one makes up the outline, but the fill stitch of the stall uses the lighter brown. Then I'd maybe simplify the background a little bit. I think I've just added a few too many stars and French knots. Overall, I think this is one of my best pieces. I felt much more confident sharing it, and it felt like I was learning what worked and what didn't work for these designs. So again, great piece. I'm happy with it. Okay, so prompt for colourful potions. It was another prompt I was really excited for. I don't think I had as much time for designing this as I had for previous prompts. So by this point, I was very aware I was going to start missing the prompt deadlines. Rather than stress about this, I decided I wouldn't do the final prompt. So that freed up some time. But that time didn't go to the sketching part. I played around with some ideas, but there were some, like the workstation with lots of shelves of potions and books, which I just didn't feel like I had the time to develop. which is a bit of a shame, but I also had an idea of adding that into prompt 5, which you'll see very shortly. I ended up going with the design with the central figure stirring up a new potion. Regarding the embroidery techniques I've used, there isn't much new in this piece other than the couching stitches I've used for like the magical smoke coming up from the fire, but I'll talk about that in a moment when reviewing the design. For the design, my favourite part are these floating little bottles. I think they feel so chaotic, which is how I feel surrounded by threads while embroidering. I think they're really effective for what they are. They're very colourful, and after prompt 2, I felt a lot more confident with my work when I felt I'd hit the prompt, which I feel these bottles do. I also like my little hat here. I apparently love little embroidered hats because they've been highlights for every piece I've decided to include a little witch's hat in. Other than that, I don't actually like this piece. Unlike prompt 2, it hasn't improved the opinion of it. Quite the opposite. My biggest disappointment with this one is the ghost. I was having real trouble making the ghost look anatomically correct. So I kept drawing the arms and thinking like, why don't these look right? And it was only while embroidering that I realised elbows exist. It does just make the ghost look like he's hugging the stirrer rather than holding it. He just looks a little frumpy and blobby and odd without elbows. Next, the cauldron doesn't look too great either. It looks like it's melting into the flames. And embroidering the cauldron was technically really difficult too. There are about 500 colours of DMC embroidery floss for the thread I use. So an embroidery artist's palette is limited, especially when looking at dark greys and black. We have 310, which is black. Then the next darkest grey is this one here. I think it's 3799. And you can see they're not actually that similar at all. Merging these two colours together is just really hard. Yeah, I don't have fond memories of embroidering this cauldron. The fire I have mixed feelings about. I actually think the flames, the shape of the fire looks good. I probably wouldn't change it. I'm just not sure about the colours I've used. I haven't embroidered fire before, so I had a bit of a look at how other embroidery artists tackled flames. And they often chose really bright yellow and oranges for the fire, contrasted with a plain black fabric. That always looked really good. It worked really well. I'm not using black fabric, but I followed their lead and used bright oranges and reds for the flames. I'd normally pick more like burnt orange or generally dark colours for the flames, more muted colours or earthy colours. I'm talking here like 918 is quite like a burnt orange colour. And I guess that's where the issue lies. I think the flames are too bright. The oranges and reds don't really fit in with the colour palette or my own personal tastes. I just don't think it feels right for me. I tried couching these swirls, which were meant to mimic like swirling magical smoke, but I don't think they look anything like smoke. They're quite thin and spindly for smoke. For a better effect, I think I needed to either make the stitches thicker by using more threads, or make the spirals tighter to make them more interesting or look thicker. Looking back at the piece, I think embroidering the smoke with regular DMC cotton thread might have been a better shout. And then, rather than using the gold and multicolored threads, I should have just used the multicolored threads for some embellishments. I could have interspersed these swirls amongst the bottles, which I think would have looked really cool and magical. Finally, you'll note that if you look carefully, you'll see some heat erasable marker lines underneath those swirls. I actually haven't ironed this piece, as I figured the pale ghost lines would show up more clearly than the darker pen lines. I do need to learn how to deal with either chalk lines or heat erasable marker lines, but just with the timing being so tight on this, I think it's something that I'll do for a later project. So prompt 5 was a spooky crafternoon. So I mentioned for prompt 4 I'd fallen behind with the prompts. Well, for this one, I'd really fallen behind, like next month behind. I didn't embroider the bulk of this piece until early November, and it wasn't completed until late mid-November. For the embroidery techniques, the main stitch is still thread painting, aka long and short stitch, with split stitch for the outlines. The new stitches I've introduced here are the satin stitch for the books, and surface darning stitch or basket weave stitch for the wool basket. And then I finally actually had the chance to use Ceylon stitch to mimic the knitting, which the ghost is currently working on. And for the overall design, I love it so much more than I thought I was when I was working my way through this piece. My favourite part has got to be the bookcase. These books were really fun and extremely therapeutic to stitch. There are some stitches which you can really relax into and enjoy, and I find satin stitch on this scale, filling in a relatively small space, but lots of small spaces, seeing it all comes together. I found it really therapeutic to complete. And it's quite colourful, but not in an overwhelming manner. It's just very homely, very comforting. I could definitely see myself just embroidering bookcases for small projects as something just a little bit fun in between larger embroidery projects. The Tiffany lamp is okay. They're so iconic, I think people will recognise what it is. However, I kept changing my mind regarding the colours. I think choosing a stronger colour palette would have made it much nicer, and it is a little bit messy. Embroidering on such a small scale is quite difficult. Similar to the first prompt, I needed to choose a colour for the tablecloth, and I decided to be brave and pick this really bright red pink, and I actually think it's kind of paid off. I love that it's so bright and it stands out, and I think it works well with the vibrant green fabric I used, and I think it also suits the colour that the ghost is embroidering with. I think it ties it all together quite nicely. And similar to the third prompt, I really enjoyed using different stitches to capture different textures and effects. So the basket weave stitch in particular I thought looked really good, and like I said, I really enjoyed using satin stitch to embroider the books. Regarding things I'd change, once again, my basic anatomy skills have let me down regarding the ghost. I tried really hard to add more texture to the blanket and to think about where the knees would be, where the hands would sit, but I haven't got it quite right. I think one of the knees in particular has sort of just disappeared. Okay, so I also debated whether choosing the larger size was the right idea. My favourite ghost was definitely the first, the little guy painting the pumpkins. He's just so small and cute. Whereas here I feel like this is the adult in the room. Maybe having a smaller design with a little ghost cross-legged in the chair would have just been a bit cuter and a bit sweeter and a bit more similar to prompt 1. I added these metallic embellishments around the edge. They're basically the same ones I added to prompt 1 and similar to prompt 1. I questioned if they were needed in the first place. I thought the scene as a whole worked really well. In the end, I actually loved it. I actually loved adding these metallic embellishments. I think the metallic embellishments feel quite fun for this piece, and I think that's what this piece feels with the bright green fabric. I think the bright colours are great, and those bookshelves are just lovely. So yeah, I'm really happy with this piece. I thought it was a good piece to end on. So final thoughts. This challenge was great. I thought the prompts were really fun. They were specific, but they left plenty of room for creativity and people's own personal styles to shine through. And it's left me wanting to do a lot more sketching, to work on my art fundamentals, and to maybe work on some more pieces like this. Also, I didn't absolutely hate Instagram while working on this challenge. I could go on with a greater purpose, and I think that meant that I got a lot more out of Instagram. I didn't suddenly, jump up and get loads more followers and stuff. But I did get a few followers out of it, and I am now following plenty of wonderful new artists, so I think that is a win in my book. However, I do have to admit that I felt overwhelmed in the end by this challenge. That's all on me. I definitely struggled to schedule sufficient time for tasks, and I really suffered for that this time around. So yeah, super happy with the end result, but I have found my limitations. I will learn from that. I won't take on as big a task again, I don't think. Anyway, welcome to the end of the video. Thank you so much for listening this far. It's really appreciated. Take care. Bye bye.